for this next session of day 2 of the 2025 Widening the Pipeline Fellowship, we're going to have a policy level view of what it means to develop sources for our stories. A lot of the earlier conversations that we've had so far in the training have helped us to think about new ways to look at our beats, look at our communities, and think about how we want to report on stories. But our two guests today have the unique and daunting task of developing sources in the federal government, in the White House, in Congress. And given the headlines that we see every day, I can't think of a bigger challenge for journalists today than to do what our two speakers do. So I want to introduce you to two journalists. First, Matt Brown is the congressional reporter for the Associated Press, and Sophia Cai is the White House reporter and West Wing Playbook author for Politico. You can read their full bios on our website at nationalpress.org. But what you should also know is that they're both Paul Miller Fellows. The Paul Miller Washington Reporting Fellowship Program has been around for 36 years now. And in my 3 years with National Press Foundation, I have been really impressed and gratified to see the diversity in the ranks of Paul Miller Fellows, the level of excellence, the type of reporting and coverage that Paul Miller Fellows produce. So we are very fortunate and very grateful to have Matt and Sophia join us today to talk about sourcing. So thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thrilled to be here.
So we're big on lived experience in this program. So I thought we'd just start by getting both of you to give us some background on your entry point into journalism and why you do what you do. So Sophia, let's start with you.
So I was born in Queens, and my dad came to this country because he was involved with the Tiananmen Square protests. And so from an early age, I just have followed the twists and turns of U.S. politics pretty closely. A lot of my earlier opportunities were not quite in politics. Specifically, they were at an NPR station in Miami, WLRN. They were a couple of business internships. And then my first gig in D.C. was as a off-hour part-time contractor at the start of COVID, when a lot of White House journalists, they had families, they didn't want to get sick in the unmasked Trump White House. And so I was the person in the late night and early mornings and weekends that they would send to be in the press pool with, many of the unmasked aides. And that was my first kind of foray into covering Trump. And I've primarily been following him since. I was at Axios, did a stint covering Congress. I highly recommend that if you're at all interested in coming to Washington. It's a great first beat because there's a lot of people to talk to. There's, really more than 400 little fiefdoms, right? And Matt can talk about this more. And then after the Afghanistan withdrawal, I ended up moving to Axios and started covering the 2022 midterms, was doing some of Biden's priorities on the Hill, and then started covering the 2024 election, starting at the start of 2023, because it's really a 2-year election cycle. My focus again was Trump, and that was, it was the first full cycle that I covered. Trump got shot. We happened to be there in Butler, Pennsylvania, and so I was filing dispatches from that scene. It was just the longest day. We had the Kamala and Biden switch, and a big part of that was how did the Trump campaign respond to that and react to that. And then we had, both conventions, and then of course we had the election. And that was a process that started in Iowa in January of last year. And it really just ended. I feel like we didn't quite catch our breath before the second term. And so now my position, I write a newsletter. We're actually going to be changing it a little bit as of today. So this newsletter started off under my old colleague, Alex Thompson, who used to be at Politico. And it started as like this, and it started under Biden. It really is a newsletter that you write about the people behind the policy. And so why is Biden making a certain decision? Who is someone who's trying to reach Biden who can't? Like, what are people gossiping about in the White House? And now, we're still trying to do that with Trump. We're also going to be doing a heavy focus on Elon Musk and Doge and the way that they are really just overturning the federal government. So that's a little bit of what I do and how I got here.
Before we go to Matt, speaking of that arc between our origin stories and why we do journalism now, is it because of your family's experience, particularly with the Tiananmen Square activity?
Yeah.
Is that what led you to want to be a journalist?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think that, sort of this pursuit of truth. I mean, both of my parents, actually, because my mom graduated in '89, so she was very much of a student that year. I mean, I kind of just grew up in my dad doesn't talk about it that much, but I really grew up in like the shadow of that event with just like a real understanding of like, you don't take the opportunity to report for granted. I think there are moments where I have gotten into some real like legal standoffs with various companies or institutions that I've been covering, and I think my dad will say, right, like he sees there being a limit to like the personal sacrifice that you give, and I do think that covering Trump it comes at a real personal cost, whether that is just like the toll it takes, the being dragged on social media. Obviously you never know that you sign up to cover like whether it's the Jan 6th insurrection or an assassination attempt. But I think I've always kind of heard about sort of this push and pull, and also what drives you to cover Afghanistan and kind of they're in a different time zone and you're on the phone at like all hours of the night with women who are trying to escape. I mean, I think there are various storylines that like really, really pull me in certain directions. And there's, I think a little bit of, I am going to get to the bottom of this, right? Like, and there's various ways to do that, I think, in every beat.
Matt, tell us about your origin story and how journalism came into your life.
Definitely. So I'm not someone who always wanted to be a journalist, but I am someone who's known that I always loved stories in one way or another. And kind of growing up in Metro Atlanta, actually, with a family who I've joked that were super great migrationers because everyone just kept going to the place where we were, frankly, safest. I was always fascinated with my family's own history and stories, and also growing up just outside of Atlanta with the dueling narratives and histories and stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that construct our own societies. So, I grew up in a place that was constantly growing, constantly changing, and got very involved actually with the Atlanta art scene, as a kid and a teenager, and was able to see kind of the contrast between, how half of my classmates who were oftentimes from all across Metro Atlanta, South Side, North Fulton, would interact. And I think that process was of just talking to different people from so many different walks of life throughout my life, really early on. I don't think that I realized it at the time, but it was a kind of journalism of trying to say, well, this is what your parents told you, this is what your parents, how you believe that this state should be constructed, or how you believe that this country came to be. And watching the debates, sometimes heated arguments, within even my own school system, sometimes even with my own family, and just kind of learning to, it just really inspired me from a very early age to care and think about what is the impact of who is being heard and listened to. So then when I got to college and I started asking myself what are the different things that I want to be doing with my life, I discovered that it turns out that if you're blogging and actually doing some of this in public, then people actually pay you for it a bit. So that process, kicked off. I did a study abroad in Havana and was able to blog from there, which actually, I guess in retrospect, some of my first race stories were about how I kept being mistaken as Cuban, so it was kind of sink or swim with my Spanish. And from there, got back to campus and just kept kind of freelancing and blogging while in college. My first real internship was at the New York Amsterdam News, which is a Harlem newspaper, when I had the opportunity to intern there. And that was, again, just kind of we just need you to work and just do the work. And having come from the South, never having lived in New York, didn't actually know all that much about New York when I first started, it was an incredible weight to be telling stories about this community, for this community, on important things like the New York City Housing Authority, on the NYPD, and what protests were happening. This was the summer of Trump and family separation, and the summer of AOC's primary challenge and whatnot, Andrew Cuomo. Just all sorts of figures who are now top of American politics, like Tish James, were coming into the national conversation at the time. So it was an incredible privilege to be in New York City for those 12 weeks that I was. And then from there, after graduation, actually started at Politico and did some work there before beginning as a fact-check reporter at USA Today. Fact-check reporters are a type of reporter that has come under some scrutiny in recent months, as folks have been questioning what is the role of misinformation in our society and whatnot. But I had that job at the beginning of the pandemic and was immediately engaged in questions over, well, what do and don't we know about COVID? What do and don't we know about the government's policies on lockdowns? What do and don't we know on the protests and whether or not you can protest outside or not? That quickly then turned into QAnon, Proud Boys, Black Lives Matter protests. 2020 was a trial by fire. We all lived through it. And that then got me. They basically said, since so much of that was covering the Trump administration, not intentionally, but so much of it was dealing with the questions that were circulating online and in the streets, literally. I was in Lafayette Square when Trump cleared it, for instance. That we ended up talking about a more national politics role thereafter. And I was on the first year of Biden when I was mostly, I was in the White House beat covering mostly breaking news, but then, increasingly started specializing kind of in the will he or won't he, Build Back Better talks, some foreign policy and whatnot. But I really zeroed in on this one thing that Biden just kept going back to, largely because of my just love of comparative politics and how different stories are competing with each other, where Biden kept saying that we are democracy versus autocracy. And this was his big talking point, if you all remember, for the longest time. And as someone who grew up in Georgia and who'd been experiencing all of those competing narratives that I described early on, I kept thinking in this briefing room, like, well, am I from a democracy? Like my grandparents told me about what my family had gone through back in the day. So I kept writing certain stories, examining, comments that Vice President Kamala Harris made, examining comments that Joe Biden made, examining how voting rights advocates and state governments were navigating the debate over the ballot, access to the ballot box. And basically kept asking, like, well, what does it mean to be a democracy? Who are you inviting to these democracy summits globally? Who gets to be a democracy here inside the United States? Who gets to be heard? And I went over then for 2 years or so to the Washington Post to help work on their democracy team there, actually, when I moved back to Georgia, to cover questions of that, just do that as a beat, kind of, and just answer this question of, like, well, what is a democracy and who actually does get to participate in it? And then from there, I joined the Associated Press, where I started answering the question, not just who has the access to the ballot box, but also do people even want to vote in this moment, as the race and politics reporter for AP. And while obviously race is still very top of mind for national politics at the moment, I am currently based on Capitol Hill, where I'm answering a lot of the questions on what is the role of Congress in this moment in our democracy. So I really think that a lot of politics reporters, if you're being a good politics reporter right now, you are a race and democracy reporter. But it is also important and useful to have people who very specifically look at those two nouns, which are some of the most capacious in American history. But that's kind of the journey that I had to get here to sit before all of you.
These two journalists embody, I think, the core of what the Widening the Pipeline Fellowship is about and what we try to impart to participants. Representation matters. And covering the issues that they cover, which, affect everybody. But their lived experience, their worldview, their expertise is necessary to tell the whole story, as far as I'm concerned. And so I want to now pivot to you, Sophia, because when we talked outside, I'm so intrigued by your opportunity now to put together a newsletter, the West Wing Playbook for Politico, in this moment and in this time. And you invoked, some of the challenges, being a woman of color, being a person of color in some of these spaces entails. So let's talk a little bit about you now navigating that space and finding sources who'll talk to you.
I think number one, when it comes to sourcing, I always say, based on who I am, it's always quality over quantity. Definitely when you're starting a beat, or if you're a breaking news reporter and you're trying to develop an expertise on a certain beat, it really is about a very systematic way of sourcing. And my approach is that, if I'm starting a new brief, for instance, say you're going to be taking on a beat covering a state house, you start with who are I would make an Excel sheet of who are the decision makers, right? If there's one person you're covering, you find out what are the daily meetings what are the daily people that person talks to. Who else is and that's a pretty small circle. Who else is influencing he or she to make that decision? And whether that's just one person or a body or a group, who is funding them? That is, it's not just broad concepts. You want a name, a title, phone numbers, and the way to go about finding phone numbers is typically people get their phone number from when they go to college. And so, there's a number of systems and databases out there where you can have potential phone numbers, and you could check by going on LinkedIn to see where do they go to college. Typically if it's the right area code, that is their phone number. And then, in the beginning, like I said, it's numbers. And so someone at one of the startups in Washington used to tell their younger reporters, you should be talking to 50 people a week. That seems like a big number, but that really dials down to, potentially 10 people a day. Of course, that's Congress, but I think when you think about it, in your head, that's it can be a text, a call, calling someone you already know. But that really gets you churning in terms of making enough contacts. That could also mean showing up to a press conference, coming up to the front and talking to one of, the speakers and just saying, hi, I'm Jordan from the San Francisco Chronicle. This is what I cover. I'm just starting to pick up this beat. I'd love to catch you for breakfast on next week. Typically, when you ask somebody in person, the answer will be yes. That being said, I think, as you're moving through this process, you're also building a body of work, which is to say, this is what I'm doing. These are the types of stories that I'm doing. And when you're moving through, starting a beat, you are able to build that track record, and people will start coming to you. So that process will get easier as you're moving along. And I always go back to this spreadsheet that I have. And when you have conversations with them, we just talked about our own stories. A part of it too is not being shy about who you are, but also being strategic about what you might be sharing with someone. So like in a column that's kind of just like other or personal. Like I like to jot down if people say like, this is my favorite sports team. Well, write that down, because if they're playing, like if their favorite sports team is like the hockey team that's playing right now, then like that's an excuse to just send them a text, be like, congrats, or like, or I mean, typically like if they have kids, those are things that as you get to know some of your sources and you're sharing, in an appropriate way, like parts of yourself, you get to know this person, as someone more than just a person that you're kind of begging for information. I think the other thing to remember is that sources, there's a reason that they talk to you. And one important reason is that you are talking to a bunch of people and have information that could be useful to them. So do see it as like a two-way relationship. And then, not every, like you will not click with everyone that you reach out to. Like you will not be besties with everybody on this beat, every Senate aide, every nonprofit group that you're covering, and that's okay. Really, I think of like sourcing almost as equivalent to like the people that I keep in my personal life. Like I read somewhere that each person really only has the capacity to have like anywhere between like 6 to 8 really close people, and that includes your family, your partner, your closest friends, people that you would visit even if you're not based in, the town that they live. And beyond that, you could have like a couple dozen acquaintances, and those are people that you check in with, people you'd go to their house party, but it's like a different level of, and that really is about capacity. If you're a journalist, for your own sanity and mental health, like you've still got to keep that, your own personal close group, but you've also got to develop like a network of sources, and you could kind of take the same approach, right? You have a smaller ring of people. If you're covering a beat, you want those people to be able to provide you with different information. So for instance, say you're covering entertainment, like you don't want to have all of the sources be from, the same band or, the same part of town or represent the same constituents, right? You want, someone who can tell you about, who's funding entertainment. You can tell someone who can tell you about the upcoming shows. You may want 1 or 2 producers for some of the biggest networks. Like that's what I'm talking about when your closest sources should be able to tell you different things. And then beyond that, you really want a really wide range of people, that in the sort of acquaintances. So like people who know who you are. You may have had coffee with them, previously, and people that you can just call. And that group, it's really about collecting phone numbers because no one's really checking email. So that's kind of my larger approach to sourcing.
That is such a good lesson, because as someone who, and I know people don't believe this, but I'm an introvert at heart, the thought of walking up to strangers or calling people cold and saying I'm Rachel Jones or whatever. I really early on in my career had to work very hard to make that feel comfortable or natural. But at this stage of my life, I view it as just planting seeds. And as you stated so brilliantly, it could be just a note. It could be a text saying, hey, I see your team won last night or whatever. Find little non-stressful ways to get on people's radar screen, because it'll pay off. It could eventually pay off down the line if news breaks or if they recall, hey, I met that reporter at a meeting the other day. Maybe I'll tell her or him this story. So that's definitely a good point, and I thank you for bringing that up. Matt, you and I, in our prep call, told this great story about walking into a diner or somewhere in Pennsylvania for a story that you were working on. Mm-hmm. I want you to sort of tell us about sourcing as a sort of a national correspondent just going all over the country versus now when it's Congress is really your sort of beat. So start with that story if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I will say as a preface to that is that institutions, until AI changes something, are all made of people. So, Congress can seem like this incredibly Byzantine organization. The FBI and the White House can seem like these incredibly impenetrable organizations, but they're fundamentally people in a building. And getting into them is a matter of knowing the people, as Sophia said, and having a relationship with them, actually. DC is a strange place because it is absolutely filled with people who know a lot of stuff that everyone else on planet Earth cares about. It is a place where everyone is broadly media trained, even if you're not a media-facing person, and then it's absolutely crawling with reporters who are all competing with each other, which means that the DC press experience that I've come in and out of throughout my career in different jobs can be a very intense one and very rewarding, very fruitful, can be fun, even I'd argue at times, if you can really devote yourself to it. But it is not how most institutions in this country actually engage with the public, let alone the media. So when this past fall, for instance, while I was covering the 2024 campaigns and going across the country to these different rallies and whatnot, really trying to parse the data and figure out where are people actually going to be voting, what do people actually want to be doing, especially in communities of color. It was expressed to me that there was an interest in just figuring out how are some of the proposed policies from the Trump and Harris campaigns going to impact business owners in the communities that actually matter. So my editor was just go to Erie, Pennsylvania. They've both been there 4 times. And they keep talking about, businesses, especially black businesses, go and just talk to some people and engage with them. And in that experience of going to, Erie, very storied city, a city that, as my reporting showed, is really trying to come back in a lot of ways. There's been a lot of interesting investment going on there, lots of economic development, people moving back to the city, including a more diverse slate of people than who were there before, though the city also was a great migration recipient in a lot of ways. The railroad literally went straight from Mississippi to Pennsylvania. So when you just kind of land in a place, and you're not there for the campaign rally. You're not there for for a big business conference, and you just have to figure out, okay, well, how am I going to get someone's trust and engage with people? And I just started working the phones and showing up in local businesses. I just went to the hardware stores, the diners, the local downtown area that's been starting to be redeveloped back. And a lot of places were just kind of you're a reporter. I didn't know that was a real thing. I didn't know you existed. No, I don't want to talk to you, but that's kind of cool. I've seen one in person now. And that just kind of walking in and just just having a human moment with people sometimes, where it's just kind of I'm writing the story, I'm trying to understand my what your community and then Erie was a special place too, because people were kind of because which way Erie goes, Pennsylvania goes, so I get it, that's why. So some people would respond with that, but a lot of people did not want to talk. A lot of other people, when sitting in either my rental car or my hotel room, just working the phones, some people would be I'll connect you to the CEO or this, that, or the other. And sometimes the CEO would pick up and be you want to talk about the manufacturing that I'm bringing back? Okay, well, I can't talk about that now. Or I can talk for 5 minutes, but I'm not going to do this. And I just say all of that because it was a lot of calls when a lot of people are not media trained before someone was actually willing to let you into their life. And that, I think, you need to appreciate and understand that the stories we tell as nonfiction, fact-based, independent journalists are not ours. And and when it's very powerful people in Washington who have things they don't want people to know about, and they don't want their stories to be told because they're doing something that people would not like if it got in public, that's called accountability journalism. But when it's telling someone, private person's story, you need to be very, very considerate and very, very empathetic with the work that you are doing, and be also very transparent with, the Associated Press is a global newswire. Our content goes all around the world to organizations far, far afield from all across the US and all across the globes, and just to be very clear with people that what that level of publicity is like. It's in a way going viral, and some people don't always appreciate that just talking to a reporter what that can entail. So finally, a couple calls started to go my way two, one going into a business and then one call. The business was a Midwestern diner. The dude was incredibly nice. He said, I will happily sit down with you and talk about the community and everything, and I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but this is what COVID did to my business. This is what the opportunity zone policies of the Trump administration did. This is what the Biden administration's investments in infrastructure and COVID stimulus have done for me, and just really going through all of that. But then more importantly, started saying, hey, like you should talk to so-and-so at Erie Health, or you should talk to so-and-so who's helping to lead the redevelopment in downtown, or you should talk to so-and-so who's helping with migrants in the community. And was just such a connector and so welcome, because he's like, these people are all my customers and they all come in every single day. And that was incredibly helpful, forever grateful to him, because just having that intro oftentimes made other people who, some of whom, frankly, might not have even returned my calls when I actually reached out directly, were suddenly very like, oh, like I want to actually engage with this person because they have the imprimatur of someone who I trust in the community. The second example is when I was working the phones and just making calls to different local businesses, a local car care company I reached out to after being told by one of the Black economic development groups in the city that this was the list of people who you should reach out to. It was like, about 100 businesses. And this one guy, he got on the phone and he said, why do you want to talk to me? And I said, well, I'm doing a story about Erie's economy in the 2024 election. Like, would you like to engage? And he said, absolutely not. Like, I hate both these candidates. Like, I don't even think I'm going to vote. Like, and I don't trust half the stuff that's in the media. And I just think it's all terrible and that no one cares about me. So, like, am I the kind of person you want to talk to? I don't really think I'm the kind of person you want to talk to now, huh? And I was like, no, you're exactly the kind of person I want to talk to. Like, I would love to hear your story. I want to speak with you. And he said, all right, sure. And I then ended up going over to his shop the next day and just sitting in front of his store while he was fixing cars. He just adopted a dog the day before, and I was literally at times watching folks like hang out of the windows of cars, like just waving at him because he's apparently an institution in the community, and just sat for hours just hearing his story, and really wanted to make clear that I wanted to be as empathetic and crystal clear and transparent as possible with the realities that he was going through and how he was viewing this moment in the country. And he connected me with some other people after that, but it took a lot of just trust building, I guess, to get folks from, the local auto shop owner to the top business leaders in the community to actually sit down and say, I'm going to have a conversation with you, I'm going to get a coffee with you. And it was an experience that I bring up because when thinking about sourcing, sometimes we can overcomplicate it. Sourcing is just people. Sourcing is just relationships. And there are a million strategies that you can come up with to figure out how can this person with vested information and very very powerful secrets, how can I get them to talk to me? And I'd love to compare notes with Sophia all day, where we can figure out, all right, like what is the best sourcing practices. But when going off into a place where oftentimes people don't know what the purpose is of you just approaching them and saying, hi, I just want to chat, and them saying, well, I don't know you, I don't trust you, like that's when there are other tactics that are necessary. And I think that the most fundamental one is just have a human moment with them. Just say, I am going to be present with you, and I am going to be a proper caretaker of whatever information you're about to tell me. And it's a fair shake. You can't do hagiography for random people on the street, but it is important to understand that you cannot go in with your own notions on what a community is or what a person is going to say, because frankly, talking on widening the pipeline, that is exactly why so many, especially communities of color in this country for so long, have not trusted, mainstream institutions and journalism, because they have not felt like they've been given a proper fair shake or they've been given a proper understanding. obviously it's not just communities of color that feel that way sometimes in this country. And that's why sometimes it's really important just to go back to first principles on what is a source and what is the story that you're trying to convey.
I've said this so many times over the years. I was doing audience engagement in 1986 when I landed at the St. Petersburg Times. I was in the Clearwater Bureau, and all of a sudden noticed there were never any stories about North Clearwater, the black community. And I said, well, I'd like to cover, and was told they don't read the paper. They don't buy ads, and so we don't have time for them. So I eventually, started going to the church or going to the community center or hanging out when I would do my laundry at the laundromat, talking to people, asking them what's going on. So that's really the moment, particularly that we're in right now, when it comes to the disruption and the sort of turbulence that's going on based on some actions coming out of the White House. And so, Sophia, talk about developing sources to report on chaos. How are you? I mean, I gave the example earlier about me being on LinkedIn and reading about the person who posted that I, maxed out my credit cards and I moved from Atlanta to DC to work for NIH, and 1 month later I'm out of a job. And so I know that some other reporters, other journalists are also putting very direct requests on LinkedIn saying, if you know somebody who's been going through this or just lost their job or whatever, hit me up. So for you and your reporting, how are you navigating that?
So I think there's the people who are creating chaos and the people who are impacted by chaos. And it's two different approaches. I think right now, just to be completely frank, of where like the mindsets of the people who work in the White House, they believe that they reign supreme, right? Like they've won the White House and both chambers of Congress. They have had plans to take on these drastic actions for literally years. And so, because I've been following some of the groups who have been hashing out plans, and getting to know some of these folks before they're in the White House, A, that helps. And B, it's being like, when it's a fast-moving story and you know that both what they're doing and what you're writing is going to create tension and controversy, like being very clear with somebody that I will never stab you from the back. It may be from the front, but you will have plenty of opportunity and time to respond to whatever it is I'm writing. And that it just creates an understanding that like you may not always like what we write or how we write it, but you will always have an opportunity to respond. And I think, and so, publicly, like that could look like a very contentious relationship, but privately, for instance, like I've had somebody from the Ron DeSantis campaign, give me a heads up that they were about to blow me up, like on social media. Like, did I enjoy that? No, but I appreciated the heads up. So there's that sort of understanding that, I'm here to do my job, they're there to do theirs. And then there's the people who are impacted, and I think reaching them is both, if you've been in Washington, like having friends or family who are willing to share their stories, but for folks that you are trying to reach and you don't have that kind of organic connection, it's Reddit pages. Like there's a Reddit page for everything. And if people are going on Reddit to vent about it, like typically they wouldn't mind venting to a reporter if, you're taking their approach that Matt has taken. So, when it comes to covering, like, to use Rachel's words, chaos or just like changing a changing federal government and you've got to like come at it from different sides. And so I think that's true of any story. And And the other thing is, I do think that there's value in being able to identify a storyline before it happens and getting to know all the stakeholder before. And wanted to, for example, like if you're really interested in, if you're an ag reporter, covering the farm bill, like even before that bill becomes the news headline, like you want to have gotten to know, the head of the ag committee, the head of the subcommittees, the people who are going to be funding this thing, like way before, and so when it's coming, and that I think carries a lot of value in journalism. Even if you're a general assignment reporter, I do think that developing that kind of expertise makes you indispensable to a newsroom.
Matt, how about you in terms of, it's a relatively new beat because you just started last month, right?
Officially beginning of January, yeah.
Okay. So when you think about, okay, I'm trying to tell the stories of the decisions that are being made and their connection to their communities that they represent, how are you building your sources?
Well, on the Hill, I think that the great thing is that there are so many people to talk to and to engage with. And the question is always, in these meeting rooms, which sometimes are just members of Congress, sometimes are members and their staff, who is the person who is actually going to have the information that you need? And generally speaking, I had a mentor once tell me that you should, in a similar vein to you should be talking to 50 people a week, that you should always once a week have three new people who you haven't talked to before. Just reach out to some new person. And a lot of that has been going to events, frankly, and just showing up at the committee hearing, just showing up in the halls, just letting people know that hi, I'm present, I'm new, I'm annoyingly ubiquitous, and that you have to, and that be in every single scrum, but also in the places where they're not expecting 50 million reporters to be. Because if you're just the face that is showing up when oh, I haven't seen the tweet, I don't want to talk about, whatever Trump or Elon just said, then they're not going to eventually trust you with the information that you really want. So a lot of it's been figuring out how to be in, off the record spaces with people, or to be both members themselves, because that's ultimately who you're covering when you're on the Hill, but then also their staff and other people who come in and out of the Hill. Again, the Hill is really the nerve center of American democracy. That's how the Constitution set it up, which means that lobbyists, activists, state government officials, folks, everyday citizens, just people are always coming in and out of that institution, both literally and metaphorically. And just mapping some of that and looking at how chaotic in itself and kind of fundamentally it is designed to be, it's been daunting, but kind of exhilarating. And I do think that some of it just comes down to saying, okay, well, what are the things that I'm interested in? Because this is literally the nerve center for American democracy. We at AP are often tasked with doing the 30,000 foot on this day in Congress story, and some of that really is just kind of sourcing up with the leadership and just knowing what's literally happening on the chamber, making sure that AP cameras are there to capture it. But sometimes when really digging down, especially in your own beat as a reporter, is to say, well, if I'm interested in questions of tech policy, or if I'm interested in questions of foreign policy, who are the members who are actually doing that work? If I'm interested in, arts funding and the Kennedy Center stuff going on with Trump, who are the members who have either socially just appeared at that place often, or who are in charge of appropriations for that particular set of the budget? And once you really break it down into more discrete beats, I think that it becomes a more manageable place. And that can be done with any institution. If you're covering Wall Street, there's the 30,000 foot story that you can do on this is the state of the streets, and it will be very sweepy and existential about American capitalism. But you can also get very discreet in saying, well, who is the environmental investments person at Goldman Sachs, or who is doing shoe investments at Morgan Stanley? The same thing with Hollywood. You can do the wow, this is what the Oscars show about the state of art in America, but you can also very specifically go and say this is the talent producer, this is the talent person for Angelina Jolie, this is the producer who's going to make this next movie. there's very discrete people who you can find and figure out like who are the people who have that information. And once you break it down, again, these towering institutions, as long as AI doesn't automate all of us, you can say this is a very discrete individual or person who has the information that actually, frankly, in AI is not going to suddenly, just put into the ether for no reason. You need a person to go to them and build that relationship. So that's the way I've been approaching it.
Before I open it up to questions, I want to quickly ask you. Ask you both to just respond to concerns about news agencies being shut out of the Pentagon and other locations. What are your thoughts about how that's going to possibly affect your own ability to get sources?
So I would say they have not shut news organizations out of the Pentagon. They're simply saying certain newsrooms don't have access to like a permanent workspace.
Okay.
So, and I think, that is kind of and I've experienced this myself with the Trump campaign, having my credential to event, like just not like, as a form of retaliation, the Trump campaign has not credentialed me for certain events for certain periods of time. You can still go as a member of the public, and that is their way of saying reporters still have access, just like any member of the public. They're simply taking it away a convenience. And trust me, they will keep track of who's still showing up to do their job, even when they're trying to make your job more difficult. And so if you approach it that way, then it's really like I'm still doing my job, and I think a lot of newsrooms, are approaching it that way. I'll let Matt respond to some of the issues that the AP has had with the White House when it comes to the Gulf of America or Mexico, depending on who you ask.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
What do they do with that information?
Hold on, you need the mic. There you go.
Gabriel Cortez, CNBC. What do they do with that information? If they're keeping track of who's still showing up after they've removed the convenience of the credential, do you get rewarded down the line, or what is the benefit of their keeping track of hard-nosed reporters who are still doing their jobs?
So I think for one, they both on the campaign and here, they keep track of like literally everything that gets said about the White House, the campaign. Even I've received texts from campaign officials that didn't like an Instagram story I put up covering like just a story and a caption about, some campaign event. Like that is the level of details, and they're keeping track of hits, and that is because I think any like group or institution wants to know like how they're being portrayed. So I don't think it's necessarily like, a part of it, yes, like if they have not credentialed you, like certainly you're on their radar for a reason, and they want to know what you're writing. So I think, it's kind of this broader, they are keeping track of everything in many ways, and you'll have to ask them like kind of how they make decisions after that. But it's, I think a part of it is just kind of having covered them for like a number of years, knowing how they operate, knowing what they care about, just knowing what they're going to get upset about, and still like putting your head down and getting back to work.
I would also just note on that the Trump administration is not actually unique in that. There's many things that are unique about the Trump campaign, Trump world, the Trump administration, but both campaigns were multi-billion-dollar operations, or were trillions of dollars in federal spending, and American democracy was on the line. There's a lot of powerful people who will pay people a lot to surveil journalists and monitor what is being said. And once you are covering them full time, congrats, you're of interest to them. So they'll be devoting someone to you, left, right, and center.
Hi, my name's Nicole Cai. Kind of have the same last name, but I'm from NPR News. A lot of us do local-based reporting, and sometimes sourcing can lack a lot of structure, and sometimes when you don't know what the story is exactly, or where it's going, or you want to learn about a new topic, I find myself having a lot of source meetings, but not really knowing like what information is there or what I could get out of it. So I'm wondering if you could share a system or some organization of, okay, this person is going to be important for this story. This person might take a little more time vetting. I might need to do more source copies. Like, I'm just wondering, like, what has worked for both of you in terms of, like, developing the sourcing and being on task with it and knowing what you're going to get out of it.
So the tabs in my Excel sheet are very useful for that. So what sorts of things would you like to develop like a beat on, or what like couple topics, like are you primarily?
Yeah, so there's certain topics, because I'm sort of a general assignment reporter, so it's not like I have a certain beat that I'm always covering. So sometimes I'm just being introduced to like cannabis laws, or I might do like a state level view of like what is this law, and then talk to people on the ground. But like sometimes I struggle with just like following up and creating like follow-up stories, and then getting more in depth with the expansion of the sourcing. And I'm also like trying to get story ideas too. So sometimes like I'll have coffees with people in certain like topics that I'm covering, but I'm not completely sure, like, I think you're important, but I don't know exactly like what you could share, or if you're gonna trust me enough to share like information that could be useful in the future.
So if I were you and say like, and you know that you're like cannabis is something you're going to be returning to. So one, I mean, a great question at the end of any conversation you have, doesn't even have to be like an on the record interview. What should we be paying attention to that's not being covered? That'll automatically get you, just get like the juices flowing for someone who's like obviously like constantly paying attention to cannabis. So like asking about who are the emerging cannabis makers, what sorts of things are like people who use cannabis concerned about, what kinds of legislation are bubbling up like in the states that like, you know, I mean, both at the local and the federal level. Like I think tapping into, and you know what, sometimes like you might come across someone who like is very detailed in like the area that they research, but they might not have a more holistic view, which means if you're looking for that, you might have to go look for a professor who's just like constantly like consuming information, can tell you, you know, the latest trend. I would say like analysts who cover specific cannabis companies, like these are also people that like business reporters are tapping into, like people who represent, like lobbyists who represent some of these companies. Yeah, I think like those are just some ways. And then, you know, if you've got like a couple, like many tabs, you know, figuratively and like literally in your portfolio, then just keep adding to, you know, have their number in your spreadsheet. Like you never know, like if this area of research or you know, whatever it is pops back up into the news, and if they're more tight-lipped, then you know, there's something called mirroring, and I know like some of our 3-letter agencies will teach this, which is just like if somebody is very high energy and willing to share, like you kind of want to try to mirror that. Like that is something that makes people comfortable. If someone is a little bit more reserved, they're a little bit, they're careful about what they say, they operate in like a slower pace, or they prefer to do email, like kind of mirroring that. And then soon enough, you'll have a sense of whether this is someone that you can rely on like regularly or not. And if it's not, like that's fine.
We can maybe take one more question because our time is.
Go ahead. I've met many.
Pass the mic back.
Hi, thank you both so much for doing this. I'm Anjali. I cover politics for the Boston Globe. Something I think about a lot in my political coverage is accessibility and who is actually going to be reading the work that I'm doing. Like I read you both very regularly because I consume politics just as a personal interest and also because it's my job. But I'm curious about, when you're writing about, say, very like turn of the screw sort of decisions in Congress or in the White House, or, very specific scoops that, the general public may not understand, what's going on in a day-to-day. To what extent are you thinking about your audience in your work and, thinking about translating politics in a way that is accessible to the public, is explaining, the stakes of things while also, making sure you're incorporating some of the nitty-gritty stuff?
That's a good question. So a part of this is the language that you use to describe what's happening. One example of this that I encountered recently was RFK Jr. in like a bipartisan off-the-record staff meeting had stated a position where it was like a very liberal position on drug pricing, which is about like seizure of like patents, and basically saying, well, if a drug price is too high, then like the government can come in and like give that patent to another company to sell it at a lower price. So I mean, that is something that is like so obscure, and like people will not understand if you just say like, like whatever phrase was used by RFK and the staffers. But if you're putting it into the larger context of like, RFK is supporting like a pretty radical way of lowering drug prices that involves like allowing another maker to like make a high priced drug, like that is something that makes it relatable to somebody making $30,000 in upstate New York. So I do think that a part of it is the language that you use. And when it comes to story selection, I think obviously you write for the Globe, like you're covering the Massachusetts delegation in Washington. And so, yeah, I think of course, like someone in Florida may not necessarily care, about like some issue that's specific to Massachusetts. But I think that's, that comes with your job and is just like something that you'll have to overcome.
I would say that the AP is maybe a bit of an understatement, a bit obsessed with what language we use and how we can convey that, precisely because we are a B2B business. Our stories are syndicated in other news outlets, so we really have to think about what is the broadest global audience possible for the work that we do. And within that, oftentimes, the conversations internally over, well, how do you explain, get through political euphemisms such as pro-life, pro-choice. We're really talking about abortion, so we should just say that. What is right to work versus a pro-union law? Like, let's just say, like, this is a law that would make it easier for people to say no to joining a union, or would allow for, employment agreements between unions and the employer to say that you are going to de facto just be a part of the union. Like we need to, and then figure out how to say that as succinctly as possible. Those are just two examples of something from the past 48 hours that of conversations that I've been in with people. And I think that's, it's a privilege to do the work that we do. And I think that thinking about the audience that we are serving with AP, it gets a little wonky, but even us, we have to think through what is the essence of what we're trying to say here, not the jargon that businesses or experts or obviously politicians want to be using, but like, how is this going to impact a real person in the world? And once you can really get down to that, and also think on the general consensus of like, well, do people recognize the city that we're talking about? Do most people even know what like the FBI is? We just colloquially say that this is what the style book is for. I think that if you have that as your guiding light, I don't think you'll come to a generally understandable position.
And on that note, I want to piggyback something Sophia said to wrap up this discussion, and that is when I worked at NPR many moons ago, I was trained in every recorded interview we had, in-studio guest or whatever, to have the last question be, so is there anything that we aren't covering that you think we should be covering? Or is there something about this that maybe we don't get right and that you would do differently? And a good 6 out of 10 times, that statement would be the one thing that wound up in the story because it was so powerful, it was so sort of authoritative, it gave the interviewee the sense that you really value their opinion and what they think about this topic. So always be mindful of opportunities to elevate or amplify what your sources are trying to tell you and say to you. So at this moment, I want us to take this opportunity to thank two incredibly informative speakers, Matt Brown of AP and Sophia Cai of Politico. Please show them our appreciation.